All right, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, as always, I'd like to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Racha HaKodash. Double honors unto the apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well. Salutations to you, sincere, hopeful elect Akim, pushing the word of Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, in spirit and in truth. Ma'ah, Arabayim, Arabai, Alak, which is to say 144,000, and the Lashawan Kodash, Sha'ar Yath, which is to say remnant. Chud Shalayashim, which is to say 1/3, and Bachayarium, which is to say elect. All right, those are the categories, the groups, the numbers that the Heavenly Father is dealing with in these times, and we pray that we are part of those. So, in the chat a couple of days ago, Akim, we're going into the intertestamental period, all right, which is the period of time between the book of Malachi and Matthew, in which that is where you will find the Maccabees. All right, the book of Maccabees is in between that time period, and so looking this up on a deep seek just to get a little bit of information on that time period, to edify. So first, I want to read this Matthew 13 and 52. It says, "Then said he unto them, Therefore every scribe which is instructed unto the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an householder, which bringeth forth out of his treasure things new and old." All right, so in the NLT it says, "Then he added, every teacher of the religious law who becomes a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like a homeowner who brings from his storeroom new gems of truth as well as old." All right, so we dig into both the Old and New Testament. When edifying, when breaking down the scriptures. All right, when preaching the gospel, and that's something that so-called Christians didn't do for the longest. They focused primarily on the New Testament, and left the Old Testament alone. But now, them seeing that you can't have one without the other. They go together. Now you got Christians that want to dig into the scriptures and tap into the Old Testament. All right, but even with that, they still shy away from the Apocrypha. Okay, in which, in order to understand who the Gentiles in the New Testament who were promised to receive salvation, that salvation being granted and opened up unto them, in order to know who those people truly are, you have to know about the intertestamental period, because that's a lot of Israelite history that people don't know about. All right, that our own people don't know about. All right, so I'm gonna just read what I wrote or what I asked. I said, and this is from DeepSeek, the app, and I said, break down to me the intertestamental period between the books of Malachi and Matthew. All right, so the purpose of me reading this is to show just how much history had happened within this, period, this 400-year period. All right, and there's way more history that happened, in this period than what's even listed. All right, but these are some key points. So it says, think of the intertestamental period, roughly 430 BC to AD 30, as a 400-year silent film. No prophets, no new scripture, but intense drama that sets the stage for Yahweh Shai, Here's the breakdown. It says the political shakeup. Who ruled the Jews? All right, the Israelites. Persian. All right, to 332 BC, Malachi's time, quiet, tolerant rule. The Greeks, 332 to 167 BC, Alexander the Greek conquers. Then his empire splits. The Jews are caught between Greek kings and Egypt, Ptolemies, and Syria Seleucids. All right. So, you had as the scriptures go into, all right, as you see here, you had after the Persians rule, we were conquered by Alexander. All right, and that's in the Apocrypha. All right, in the book of Maccabees, First Maccabees, which brothers, read this. From time to time when edifying, going into history. So I'm gonna read matter of fact, let me just read from 1. First Maccabees 1:1. It says, and it happened after that Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came out of the land of Chittim, had smitten Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, and he reigned in his stead the first over Greece. All right, so Alexander was the first, Edomite to rule on a real level, by way of Chittim, all right, or Greece, okay, and made many wars and won many strongholds and slew the kings of the earth and went through the ends of the earth and took spoils of many nations, insomuch that the earth was quiet before him, whereupon he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. And he gathered a mighty strong host and ruled over countries and nations and kings who became tributaries unto him. All right, so he went throughout the earth and put a lot of people in captivity, man. All right, ruled over a lot of nations, had them subject unto his rulership, so on and so forth. Okay, making them tributaries. All right. Verse 5, it says, and after these things he fell sick and perceived that he should die. Wherefore he called his servants, such as were honorable and had been brought up with him from his youth, and parted his kingdom unto them while he was yet alive. So while he was, pretty much on his deathbed but still alive, he parted the kingdom, that he conquered, the known road at that time. He split it between his 4 generals. All right. Verse 7, so Alexander reigned 12 years and then died, and the servants bare rule every one in his place. Okay. And after his death, they all put crowns upon themselves. So did their sons after them many years, and evils were multiplied in the earth. Okay. So evil, all right, took a whole new meaning when, the Edomites took over. Okay. So those 4 generals that he had set up were Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lacenaicus, and Cassander. Okay. So Cassander, Lacenaicus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. All right. So this is literally, we just read it in the scriptures. All right. So going back to what Deep Seek said, it said here for the Greek, it says 332 through 167 BC, Alexander the Great, or the Greek conquers, then his empire splits, which we just read that in First Maccabees. The Jews were caught between Greek kings in Egypt, Ptolemy, and Syria Seleucids. Okay. So Antiochus Epiphanes, which came from the Seleucid line, ruled up in Syria. Meanwhile, you had the Ptolemies that ruled down in Egypt, being both the Syrians and the Ptolemies, or the Ptolemies and Seleucids, being Edomites, were both culture vultures because they were not the original inhabitants of both these Hamitic lands. All right. So it says Syrian tyranny, 175 through 167 BC. It says the madman King Antiochus, what is that? The fourth Epiphanes, desecrates the temple. I'm horrible with Roman numerals, so Salakia if that's not right. Um, desecrates the temple, sacrifices pigs on the altar, and outlaws Judaism. This sparks. Okay, so when you go into First Maccabees as well, you read about this event, which we went into at our camp this past week. You had Antiochus that waged war against the Ptolemies, or against Ptolemy down in Egypt. He had two campaigns, and after each campaign, he went back to Syria. But on the way to Syria, back to Syria, he stopped in Jerusalem, and just stole, just was a demon. You know what I'm saying? He put a lot of Israelites to death. So on and so forth. Okay. It says Jewish independence. All right, Israelite independence, 167 through 63 BC. It says the Maccabean revolt wins freedom. The Hasmonean dynasty rules as priest kings, a corrupt mix of church and state. All right, which you had the Maccabees that went around liberating Israelites that were suffering persecution from Edomites. All right, and heathen as in general, but in specific, Esau. It says Roman occupation, 63 BC on. Pompey conquers Jerusalem. Enter Herod the Greek, a brutal half-Jewish puppet king. All right, he was an Edomite. All right, his mom, his mom's side was, went back to Israel, but his father's side went, back to Esau, Edom. It says, who rebuilds the temple but rules just before Yahushua is born. It says the religious and cultural shift. So this is a lot of stuff that has happened. All right. This is a lot of stuff that has happened. The Persians ruled, the Greeks ruled. All right. You had the Syrian tyranny. All right. Then you had the Maccabean revolt. Okay. Then you had Roman occupation. All right. So number 2, it says the religious and cultural shift. It says Hellenism. Greek language and philosophy became universal. The Old Testament is translated into Greek, the Septuagint, the Bible, Yahushua and Paul quoted. Okay. So you had Israelites during this period become Hellenized. All right. To where, that Greek language, fashion, way of life became a normality for a lot of Israelites in that region of the earth at the time. Okay. It says the new Jewish sects. It says emerged to cope Pharisees. All right, a grassroots synagogue focus, believed in resurrection and oral law, spiritual forefathers of modern Judaism. It says which they're with them saying that forefathers of modern Judaism, they're not talking about us, the Israelites, all right, the true biblical Israelites. They're talking about, Esau, Edom. Okay, it says Sadducees, aristocratic, temple only, rejected resurrection and angels, literalists. All right, so they weren't all that spiritual. All right, the Sadducees, the Essenes, monastic hermits, likely wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, who fled to the desert awaiting apocalypse. Zealots, violent revolutionaries waiting to overthrow Rome. Okay, so you had all these different sects, arise during, this period of time. Okay, in between the book of Malachi and Matthew, all right, around 400 years. It says new institutions of literature. It says synagogues replaced the temple as the center of worship since the temple was defiled and far away. Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court ruling on religious law. Apocalyptic literature, books like Daniel, written late, and non-canonical works, Enoch, Jubilees, popularized angels, demons, and a coming Messiah. Key non-biblical events. It says Hanukkah originates the rededication of the temple after Antiochus. Okay, which this is that's in the scriptures. All right, Hanukkah. All right, it's in the Apocrypha. Okay, so the fact that our forefathers celebrated Hanukkah, which that's not found, in the so-called Old Testament or the so-called New Testament, is found in the Apocrypha. All right, so our forefathers kept that high holy day, and if you aren't privy or know about the Apocrypha, you would never come across the account of Hanukkah. Okay, so that's why this 400-year period of history is very important. Okay, Pharisaic oral law, it says, begins to be codified, eventually becoming the Mishnah, the basis of the Talmud, which this is bullshit. Okay, the Talmud is straight bullshit. All right, that's dealing with them small hats. All right, that is the Talmud has nothing to do with the Holy Scriptures. Okay, it says the messianic expectation by the time of Matthew, by the time of Matthew, Jews are chafing under Rome and clinging to prophecies like Daniel's 70 weeks. Many expect a conquering king like David to overthrow Rome, or a heavenly priest to purify the temple. Nobody expected a suffering servant who dies on the cross, which is why Yahushua surprised everyone. Okay, it says the bottom line, this era transformed Judaism from a rural temple-based faith to a worldwide synagogue-based religion. It created the political tension, religious parties, and desperate hope for a Messiah that made the stage perfectly ripe for the gospel. Okay, so that's a nice chunk of history. That's a nice chunk of history right there that happened in that 400-year period, which, like I said, there's way more that had actually taken place during that period of time. All right. I wanted to look up the account of Hanukkah real quick. And it is in First Maccabees 4, and starting at verse. Let me see. All right, starting at verse 30, 36. All right, First Maccabees 4, verse 36, and it reads, it says, "Then said Judas and his brethren, Behold, our enemies are discomfited. Let us go up to cleanse and dedicate the sanctuary. Unto this all the hosts assembled themselves together and went up into the Mount Zion. And when they saw the sanctuary desolate and the altar profaned and the gates burned up and shrubs growing in the courts as in a forest or in one of the mountains, yea, and the priests' chambers pulled down, they rent their clothes and made great lamentation and cast ashes upon their heads." Just imagine going to your grandparents' house. You know, you going to go visit your grandparents' house. You heard something happen to them or something, and when you get there, it's not what you remembered as a child. You know what I'm saying? It's just totally jacked up. You know, door kicked in. You know, plates and bowls and silverware on the ground, tables turned over. You know, if they got medication in their bathroom, it's all on the ground. Um, you know, clothes all over the place, bed flipped upside down, windows broken. You know what I'm saying? Might be blood here and there, refrigerator all knocked over. Rotten food. Things just totally desecrated. That's what you know. Uh, uh, Esau. That's what they did to the temple. That's what they did. They desecrated. What was holy. Okay, so that was a sore sight to see. For these men of the Lord. All right, so verse 40 it says, "And fell down flat on the ground upon their faces, and blew an alarm with the trumpets, and cried toward heaven. Then Judas appointed certain men to fight against those that were in the fortress, until he had cleansed the sanctuary. So he chose priests of blameless conversation, such as had pleasure in the law, who cleansed the sanctuary and bare out the defiled stones into an unclean place. And when, as they consulted what to do with the altar or burnt offering, which was profane, they thought it best to pull it down, lest it should be a reproach to them, because the heathen had defiled it, wherefore they pulled it down." All right, and the way the heathen defiled it was by sacrificing pork, on it. You know what I'm saying? Just imagine you got a barbecue pit, a grill, um, or what's that? A smoker, and you leave somewhere and you come back and some Edomites is smoking at your house, smoking some goddamn a whole pig on your smoker, man. That's just defiled. Okay, that's an unclean sacrifice. Okay. So they didn't even want a chance to. They didn't even want to try and clean it and then sacrifice lamb or whatever was righteous on that, and then it'd be a reproach, and the Most High not be pleased with that. So they just you know totally you know you know took it down. Verse 44 says, and when they consulted what to do with the altar of burnt offering, which was profane, they thought it best to pull it down, lest it should be a reproach to them, because the heathen had defiled it. Wherefore they pulled it down and laid up the stones in the mountain of the temple in a convenient place until there should come a prophet to show what should be done with them. Then they took whole stones according to the law and built a new altar according to the former, and made up the sanctuary and the things that were within the temple, and hollowed the courts. They made also new holy vessels, and into the temple they brought the candlestick and the altar of burnt offering and the incense and the table. And upon the altar they burned incense, and the lamps that were upon the candlestick they lighted, and they that they might have light in the temple. Furthermore, they set the loaves upon the table and spread out the veils, the veils, and finished all the work which they had begun to make. Now on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is called the month Caslu, in the 148th year, they rose up betimes in the morning and offered sacrifice according to the law upon the new altar of burnt offerings which they had made. Look at what time and what day the heathen had profaned it. Even in that was it dedicated with songs and cisterns and harps and cymbals. Then all the people fell upon their faces, worshiping and praising the Most High of heaven, who had given them good success. And so they kept the dedication of the altar 8 days, and offered burnt offering with gladness, and sacrificed the sacrifice of deliverance and praise. They decked also the forefront of the temple with crowns of gold, and with shields, and the gates and the chambers they renewed, and hanged doors upon them. Thus was there very great gladness among the people, for that the reproach of the heathen was put away. Moreover, Judas and his brethren, with the whole congregation of Israel, ordained that the days of the dedication of the altar should be kept in their season, from year to year, by the space of 8 days, from the 25th day of the month Caslu, with mirth and gladness. Okay, so this is a celebration of the 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 temple being dedicated, back to or the dedication of the altar. All right, so that's you can't you find that the Lord Yahweh Shai kept this high holy day, yet you find it in the Apocrypha. All right, which once again Christians don't deal with the Apocrypha. So that's a whole bunch of history that they aren't privy to, or they'll totally skip over and try to associate the salvation that is promised to the Gentiles to be salvation to all nations, when that's clearly not the case. All right. So now I want to grab. Well, I did have something, so I could. All right, so here, this is just off of Google, and what I typed in was list of different generations of American black people, starting with slavery unto now. And so, me asking that question is just to show that there's a lot that can happen, in the span of 400 years. Okay, because once again, it was about 400 years from the time of Malachi to the book of Matthew. Even our captivity in ancient Egypt was about 400 years, a little over 400, about 430. And, we've been here in America for over 400 years. So, our people have, when you look at how Israelites have progressively gotten worse, you know, um, and striven further and further away from, Yahweh Shem Yahushai, even in captivity, that shows you how our people, during the time of, being Hellenized, got pulled away from serving the Lord and took on Greek customs, heathenistic customs, Roman customs. All right, look at Jake. There's all kind of people that you grew up with, that might have went to church, might have claimed to believe in God, and now they all bugged out of their mind. You know, just progressively have gotten worse due to the influence that comes with being here in America. Right, so to show you know what can happen and what has happened to our people, the different things we've experienced while just being here in America. All right, for 400 years. Okay, so I'm gonna read some of this. This is once again from Google. I said list of different generations of American black people, starting with slavery until now. It says the history of black people in America spans roughly 15 to 17 human generations since 1619. Rather than distinct biological groups, historians and sociologists track these eras by major social shifts from bondage through freedom, uh, civil rights, and the modern era. It says the colonial and enslavement era, 1619 to 1865. It says the foundation generation, 1619 through 1780s. It says the first captive Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. Early arrivals sometimes navigated fluid legal statutes like indentured servitude, but laws quickly hardened into hereditary race-based chattel slavery. The antebellum generations, 1790s through 1865, spanning the cotton boom, the internal slave trade, and the growth of free black communities in the North and South. This era produced legendary abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. Post-emancipation and Jim Crow, 1865 through 1940s. The Emancipation Reconstruction generation, 1865 through 1890s. The first generation born free or newly liberated after the Civil War. They built independent churches, families, and schools, and briefly held political office before the rise of violent disenfranchisement. The Jim Crow early migration generation, 1900s through 1940s. It says families who lived under severe segregation laws in the South and the earliest wave of the Great Migration to northern and western industrial cities. civil rights in modern era, 1940s through present. Now, meanwhile, each one of these generations progressively got worse to land us where we see what we see with Israelites today. All right, a bunch of YNs, a bunch of young hoes, a bunch of thoughts, a bunch of uh, uh, homosexuals, a bunch of reprobates, a bunch of deadbeat dads, a bunch of no good uh, old whole single mothers. All right, in mass. Okay, in which it's all about Shemal Shah that ultimately had this happen to us. All right, for our iniquities. Okay, so just how we in this current day and age as Israelites have gotten worse being in captivity under Esau Edom, well, it was the same thing back during the time of the Greeks and the Romans. You know, a lot happens, in that space of time. All right, which is why um the gospel has to be preached and be opened up to our people in these last days to remind them who they are. Okay. Matter of fact, let me read that. Grab that in Peter. This is 2 Peter 3:1. It says, "This second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you, in both which I stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance." Okay, so for this gospel to resonate with any of the hearers out there, all right, that lets you know that this word is within you, but it just had to be stirred up by way of remembrance. Okay, because if this word is within you, it's within your spirit. All right, the flesh has nothing to do with it. It's in your spirit, meaning that you had it with you back when Yahweh Shah was on the scene, because this is that chosen generation. All right, the same generation we see on the earth is the same generation that was on the scene with Yahweh Shai over 2,000 years ago. Okay, so that's why it's important for the gospel to be preached. All right, so civil rights in modern eras, 1940s to present. It says the civil rights greatest generation. It says 1940s through 1960s. It says the architects and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement who dismantled legal segregation, fought in World War II, and secured the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The late 20th century generation, 1970s through 1990s, it says those who entered adulthood post-civil rights legislation, breaking new barriers in politics, corporate life, media, and arts. And they got worse, man. All right, civil rights, you had Jakes pretty much fighting to be coons, to be equal with Esau. Okay, and then this 1970s and 1990s, this 20th century generation, they were drugged out. That's our parents' generation right there. Okay, 60s, 70s, 80s. All right, there's all drugged out alcoholics. Deadbeat dads. Uh, um, you know, crackhead mothers, crackhead fathers, heroin. Okay, all kind of wickedness that our people was partaking in because they felt liberated and that whole Woodstock era. All right, it produced a bunch of reprobates. All right, amongst the Israelites. Okay, it says, and lastly, the contemporary millennial and Gen Z generation, 2000s to present. And this generation right here, oh my goodness. All right. It says modern generations of black Americans navigating a digital globalized world shaped by historic milestones like the election of the first black president, U.S. president, and cultural movements like Black Lives Matter. All right. So, with Obama, that Hamite, with him getting in the office, that really jacked up, Israelites, so-called Negroes in particular, because Jake just lost their minds when when he got elected. It, you got more Israelites that wants to be into politics. You know, uh, like I said, Jake lost their mind when that Hamite got elected, thinking that he was one of us. All right, so through this period of time, you can see how Jake progressively got worse and worse, and it was nothing different than what happened to us during the time of being Hellenized under the Greeks. The Syrians, the Romans, the Egyptians. Okay, so to for so-called Christians to want to discard the Apocrypha, you are discarding a vast chunk of history that is vital to understanding the mystery, that's vital to completing the puzzle. Just as if you were to, like Esau in today's day and age, they want to do away with slavery. They want to take it out the history books. So if they were to, you know, do away with the history of how so-called Negroes got to this country and the things that we went through, all right, along with the Northern Kingdom too, all right, the so-called Latinos and natives. Can't forget about what they went through, all right, because we were oppressed together. To try and do away with all that history, it's going to be a void, all right, a noticeable void. Um, time is just gonna correct, you know. And I went into Egypt as well. The what we experienced in Egypt. Um, but I think I pretty much made the point, man. I don't want to make this too long. So Abaratazah, this was edifying. Until next time, I say shalom.